They say the most dangerous criminals are the ones you never see coming. Not the flashy mobsters in Chicago's smoky speakeasies. Not the Tommy gun-wielding bank robbers making headlines coast to coast. No, the most dangerous ones are the ghosts, the men who move through communities like shadows, trusted by everyone, suspected by no one. The ones who wear overalls instead of tailored suits, who shake your hand at church on Sunday, and who rob you blind by Monday morning dot before we step into the cornfields and disappear into the fog of rural Iowa in the 1920s. I want to know where. Are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you curled up at midnight, letting this story wash over you in the dark? Or maybe you're driving through your own quiet town, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind those farmhouse windows. Drop a comment below and let me know. Because this story, this true story, could have happened anywhere. It could be happening right now, in a place just like yours. This is the story of Jake Farrow, Iowa's most unlikely outlaw, a man who became a legend without ever firing a shot in anger, a bandit who never wore a mask, and a criminal mastermind who convinced an entire county he was their friend. This is the story of quiet crimes, long cons, and the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any bullet ever could dodge. So settle in. Turn up the volume. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone. Let's begin. The autumn of 1923 painted Iowa in shades of gold and rust. The kind of beauty that makes you forget winter's coming cruelty. In Marshall County, a stretch of farmland so flat you could see tomorrow's weather on the horizon, life moved at the pace of the seasons. Farmers rose with the sun, worked until their backs screamed for mercy, and went to bed with dirt still under their fingernails. It was honest work, hard work, the kind of life that builds character, they said. Jake Farrow seemed to embody everything these people valued. At 32 years old, he had the weathered face of a man who'd earned his place in the world, not inherited it. Tall and lean, with hands that looked like they'd wrestled with plenty of fence wire and stubborn livestock, Jake moved through Marshall County like he belonged there. And why wouldn't he? He'd been there for nearly 3 years by that point, working odd jobs, helping neighbors with their harvests, showing up at barn raisings with a hammer in one hand and a genuine smile on his face. People trusted him. That was Jake's greatest asset, though nobody realized it at the time. In a community where a man's word was his bond and a handshake sealed deals worth thousands of dollars, trust was currency. And Jake Farrow was rich beyond measure. He'd arrived in Marshall County in the winter of 1921. Stepping off a train in Marshalltown with nothing but a worn canvas duffel bag and a story about coming back from the war. The Great War had ended 3 years prior, but men were still drifting home, still trying to find their footing in a world that had moved on without them. Nobody questioned Jake's vague references to service, his occasional distant stare, or the way he sometimes flinched at loud noises. They'd seen it before. Shell shock, they called it. The invisible wounds of men who'd seen too much. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Jake Farrow had never set foot in France. He'd never worn a uniform, never stood in a trench, never fired a rifle at another human being. The only war Jake had fought was a private one, a quiet campaign of deception and theft that had taken him across 5 states in as many years, always moving always one step ahead of the law and his own reputation. But Iowa was different. Iowa was where he would make his stand. Iowa was where he would build something that would outlast the quick scores and narrow escapes of his earlier years. Iowa was where Jake Farrow would become an artist. He started small, the way all great criminals do. A borrowed tool that never quite made it back to its owner. A fence post that got accidentally moved in the middle of the night, shifting property. Lines just enough to matter when harvest time came. 20 bushels of corn that went missing from a grain elevator, written off as a clerical error. Nothing big enough to raise alarms. Nothing obvious enough to point fingers at anyone in particular. Jake watched and learned. He studied the rhythms of farm life with the intensity of a naturalist observing a new species. He learned which farmers checked their equipment sheds daily and which ones couldn't remember what tools they owned. He learned which widows were too proud to ask for help and which young men were too trusting for their own good. He learned where the gossip flowed and where secrets festered. He learned who was desperate, who was ambitious, and who was just one bad season away from losing everything. And then he learned how to exploit every single one of them. By the summer of 1922, Jake had positioned himself as the most helpful man in 3 townships. Need someone to watch your livestock while you visit family in Des Moines. Jake would do it, and he wouldn't accept a dime. Having trouble with that old thresher? Jake knew a thing or two about engines, learned it in the service. Don't you know? Worried about those storm clouds rolling in and half your wheat still standing? Jake would rally the neighbors, organize a harvesting party, work straight through the night if he had to. He was everywhere and nowhere, essential and invisible. The man everyone knew and nobody really knew at all. It was the Hendersons who first gave Jake the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Thomas Henderson owned 200 acres of prime farmland south of State Center, a modest spread by Iowa standards but valuable nonetheless. His wife Martha had inherited another 150 acres from her father, land that sat largely unused but rich with potential. They were good people. Church every Sunday, contributed to every community fundraiser. The kind of folks who still believed in their neighbors. That was their mistake. Jake had been cultivating his relationship with the Hendersons for over a year. He'd helped Thomas repair his barn roof after a windstorm. He'd sat at their dinner table a dozen times, charming Martha with stories and making their 2 young sons laugh with card tricks. He'd earned their trust the way a farmer earns his harvest, patiently, methodically, one careful season at a time. In August of 1922, Thomas Henderson approached Jake with a proposition. He wanted to modernize his operation, buy one of those new combine harvesters he'd seen demonstrated at the county fair. But the machine cost money, serious money, and Thomas wasn't sure about taking out a loan from the bank in Marshalltown. Banks were cold institutions, he said, run by city men who didn't understand the soul of farming. What he needed was a partner, someone he could trust, someone who understood the value of hard work and honest dealing. Jake Farrow appeared to think about it for exactly the right amount of time. Not too eager, not too reluctant. Just a man weighing a serious decision the way serious men do. 3 days later, they shook hands on a deal. Jake would invest $2,000 money he claimed to have saved from his pre-war days, working railroad construction, and in return, He'd become a silent partner in the Henderson farm. They'd split the profits from the increased yields that the new equipment would bring, all very proper, all very legal. Thomas even insisted they draw up papers, get everything in writing. Jake agreed readily. He knew a lawyer in Marshalltown, he said, a good man who'd do the paperwork cheap. Thomas didn't need to bother himself with the trip to town. Jake would handle everything. And he did. The papers were drawn up, signed, and filed. Everything looked legitimate because, on the surface, everything was legitimate. Jake had learned long ago that the best crimes are the ones that don't look like crimes at all, that hide in plain sight behind proper documents and legal language and the assumption of good faith. What? Thomas Henderson didn't know what he wouldn't discover until it was far too late was that those papers gave Jake Farrow far more than a simple partnership. Hidden in the dense legal language, buried among clauses about profit sharing and operational responsibilities, were provisions that would allow Jake to claim ownership of the entire Henderson property if certain conditions weren't met. Conditions that Jake himself controlled. Conditions that seemed reasonable at the time but were actually carefully constructed traps. The $2,000 Jake invested? It wasn't his money. It was a loan from a shady financier in Cedar Rapids, a man who asked no questions and charged interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. But Thomas didn't know about that loan, and he didn't know that Jake had structured the entire deal so that when the time came, and the time would come, Jake could trigger the default clauses, call in his investment, and force the Hendersons off their own land. It was brilliant in its cruelty, legal in its execution, and absolutely devastating in its consequences. But that wouldn't happen for months yet. For now, in the late summer of 1922, Jake Farrow was just a good neighbor helping out a friend. Just another honest man trying to make an honest living in the heartland of America. Just a ghost in the grain, invisible until the harvest revealed what he'd really been planting all along. The combine arrived in September, gleaming and modern, a promise of progress and prosperity. The Henderson boys ran circles around it, whooping with excitement. Martha Henderson smiled, probably the widest smile she'd worn in years, seeing her husband's dream taking shape in their farmyard. And Thomas Henderson shook Jake Farrow's hand again, thanking him, telling him he didn't know what they'd do without such a good friend. Jake smiled back, warm, genuine, completely convincing. Inside, he was already counting the months until foreclosure, winter, came to Iowa the way it always did, without mercy and without apology. By December of 1922, Marshall County was locked in ice, the fields sleeping beneath blankets of snow, the sky that particular shade of gray that makes you forget what the sun looks like. It was the kind of winter that tested people, that sorted the weak from the strong, that made even the strongest question why their grandparents had ever thought settling this godforsaken prairie was a good idea. But for Jake Farrow, winter was opportunity. When the ground froze and the work stopped, farmers became vulnerable in ways they never were during the growing season. Money got tight. Feed for livestock had to be bought. Repairs that had been put off all year suddenly became urgent. And the long, dark months gave people time to think, to worry, to imagine all the things that could go wrong when spring finally arrived. Jake understood this psychology intimately. He'd seen it play out in Wisconsin, in Illinois, in Missouri. Desperation was a universal language, and he spoke it fluently. He expanded his operations carefully, methodically, the way a spider expands its web. The Henderson deal had been his proof of concept, his demonstration that the model worked. Now it was time to scale up. His next target was the Carmichael family, who ran a dairy operation west of Gilman. They were newer to the area, having bought their farm only 5 years earlier, which meant they were still carrying substantial debt from that purchase. Vernon Carmichael was in his mid-40s, a hard worker, but not a shrewd businessman, the kind of man who was better with cows than with numbers. His wife, Louise, kept the books, but she'd had little education and struggled with the mathematics of interest, rates and amortization schedules. Jake had met them at a church social in November, had struck up a conversation about the challenges of dairy farming in Iowa's climate, had listened with apparent sympathy to Vernon's complaints about the price middlemen were paying for milk. By the second conversation, Jake was offering advice. By the third, he was offering to help them find a better deal. What Jake actually did was introduce the Carmichaels to one of his associates, though Vernon and Louise didn't know they were associates, a man named Samuel Price, who ran what appeared to be a legitimate dairy cooperative out of Iowa City. Price offered the Carmichaels a contract that seemed too good to be true. Guaranteed prices, reliable pickup schedules, even an advance payment to help them through the winter. It was, of course, too good to be true. The contract was designed to fail. The prices were guaranteed only if production met certain quotas that were calculated to be just slightly higher than the Carmichael farm could realistically produce, especially in winter. The pickup schedules were subject to reasonable delays that would be defined entirely by Price's company. And the advance payment? That was actually a high-interest loan secured against the farm itself, though the language was so convoluted that Louise Carmichael didn't understand what she was signing. Within 3 months, the Carmichaels would be in default. Within 6 months, they'd lose their farm. And Jake Farrow and Samuel Price would own a productive dairy operation acquired for pennies on the dollar. All completely legal, all properly documented. But the Carmichaels were just one thread in an increasingly complex web. Jake was simultaneously working at least 5 other schemes across Marshall County and the surrounding areas, each one tailored to its specific target, each one designed to look like legitimate business right up until the moment the trap snapped shut. There was the grain storage scheme, where Jake convinced farmers to consolidate their grain in a central facility he'd invested, in a facility that existed more on paper than in reality, and which would conveniently burn down the following summer with all the grain inside leaving. Jake to collect insurance money while the farmers received nothing. There was the equipment lending circle, where Jake organized farmers to pool their resources and share expensive machinery, except the shared equipment was actually being sold off piece by piece to buyers in other counties, replaced with cheaper versions that would break down at crucial moments during planting or harvest season. There was the seed consortium, where Jake sold farmers access to what he claimed were new, high-yield seed varieties developed by agricultural scientists, seeds that were actually just ordinary. Stock dressed up with impressive-sounding names and scientific jargon, priced at triple their actual value. Each scheme was brilliant in its own way. Each one exploited the particular vulnerabilities of rural communities. The isolation that made it hard to check references, the trust that made people accept a handshake as a contract, the pride that kept struggling farmers from admitting they needed help until it was too late. And Jake was the center of it all, the friendly face connecting the dots, the helpful neighbor who always seemed to know a guy who could solve your problems. He never appeared greedy. He never pushed too hard. He let people come to him, let them think the solutions were their own ideas. It was during this period that Jake made what might have been his only mistake. He got cocky. He'd been operating in Marshall County for over a year without serious challenge. The few people who'd begun to suspect something wasn't quite right about Jake Farrow were isolated voices, easily dismissed as gossips or troublemakers. And the scale of what he was doing, the sheer audacity of it, was actually working in his favor. It was so big, so brazen, that most people couldn't conceive of it. Nobody wanted to believe that someone could be systematically defrauding an entire community. It was easier to believe in bad luck, in honest mistakes, in the inevitable hardships of farm life. But there was one person who was watching. One person who was keeping track of the connections, the coincidences, the pattern of misfortune that seemed to follow in Jake Farrow's wake. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, and she was the widow of the former county clerk. At 63 years old, Eleanor was sharp as a tack and twice as hard. She'd helped her husband manage county records for 30 years before his death in 1920, and she'd seen enough land deals and business transactions to know what legitimate business looked like. More importantly, she knew what it smelled like when something was rotten. Eleanor had been watching Jake since the summer of 1922. When she'd noticed him at the county courthouse filing papers for the Henderson partnership. Something about the deal had bothered her, though she couldn't put her finger on it at the time. The documents were in order. The signatures were legitimate. Everything was proper. But Eleanor trusted her instincts, and her instincts told her that Jake Farrow was a problem. She began quietly asking questions. Nothing too obvious. Just casual conversations with people who'd done business with Jake. Just gentle inquiries about how those deals had worked out. Whether everyone had gotten what they expected. Whether there had been any surprises. The responses were interesting. Most people had nothing but praise for Jake. He was helpful, generous, always willing to lend a hand. But when Eleanor pressed for specifics, when she asked exactly how certain transactions had been structured, she started noticing things, small things, inconsistencies in the stories, details that didn't quite add up, money that had changed hands, but couldn't quite be accounted for. Promises that had been made, but somehow never quite put in writing. By January of 1923, Eleanor had filled 2 notebooks with observations. She didn't have proof of anything illegal Jake was too careful for that, but she had something almost as valuable. She had the outline of his pattern. She could see the shape of what he was doing, even if she couldn't yet see all the details. The question was what to do about it. Eleanor Briggs was not a woman who acted rashly. She knew that going to the sheriff with nothing but suspicions and circumstantial evidence would accomplish nothing except warning Jake that someone was onto him. She needed something concrete, something undeniable. So she waited. She watched. She gathered her evidence one careful piece at a time, building a case the way Jake had built his empire, patiently, methodically, one calculated move at a time. Meanwhile, Jake continued his work, oblivious to the danger. Or perhaps not oblivious. Perhaps he knew someone like Eleanor was inevitable, had always been part of the plan, just another risk to be managed. Because Jake Farrow hadn't survived this long. By being naive. He knew that every operation had a shelf life, that you could only fleece the same community for so long before someone caught on. The question was whether he could finish what he'd started before that someone became a problem. The spring of 1923 was when everything would come to a head. The spring was when all those carefully planted seeds, both literal and figurative, would either sprout or wither. The spring was when Jake would either complete his masterpiece or watch it all come crashing down. But before spring could arrive, winter had one more card to play. In February, a blizzard swept across Iowa with apocalyptic fury, the kind of storm that old-timers would talk about for decades. It lasted 3 days, dumping snow measured in feet rather than inches, with winds that turned the landscape into a whiteout hell where you couldn't see your own barn from your back door. Livestock froze to death, roofs collapsed, roads became impassable. And in that chaos, Jake Farrow saw opportunity. He moved through the aftermath of the storm like a benevolent ghost, organizing rescue efforts, helping dig out snowbound families, checking on isolated farms. He was everywhere, helping everyone, asking nothing in return. It was exactly the kind of behavior that reinforced his reputation as a selfless neighbor and good man, but it was also reconnaissance. Jake was assessing damage, calculating vulnerability, identifying which farmers had been hit hardest and would be most desperate for help when the bills came due. He was planning his endgame, setting up the final moves that would let him cash out and disappear before anyone realized the full extent of what he'd done. Eleanor Briggs saw him during those days, saw him pulling a family's wagon out of a snowdrift, saw the genuine gratitude on their faces, and for just a moment she wondered if maybe she'd been wrong about him. Maybe Jake Farrow really was just a good man in a hard world. Then she remembered her notebooks. She remembered the pattern. She remembered that the most dangerous predators are the ones that look like they belong in the herd. The storm passed. Spring approached. And in Marshall County, Iowa, 2 opposing forces moved toward their inevitable collision. Jake Farrow racing to complete his greatest con, and Eleanor Briggs racing to stop him before he destroyed everything these people had worked their entire lives to build. Only one of them could win. The question was which one would move faster when the time finally came. Asterisk. Spring arrived in Marshall County like a promise, half-kept warm days followed by freezing nights, muddy fields that alternated between soup and concrete, skies that couldn't decide between rain and sunshine. It was the season of optimism, when farmers believed again that this year would be different. This year would be better. This year the work would finally pay off. Jake Farrow understood that optimism. He counted on it. By April of 1923, his various schemes had reached critical mass. The Henderson farm was 2 months away from foreclosure. The Carmichael dairy was already in default, though Vernon and Louise didn't fully understand the depths of their trouble yet. The grain storage facility existed as a legal entity, with a dozen farmers having already committed their fall harvest to its non-existent bins. The equipment lending circle had siphoned off nearly $15,000 worth of machinery. The Seed Consortium had collected advance payments from 43 farmers across 3 counties. It was beautiful in its complexity, terrible in its scope. Jake had transformed an entire agricultural community into a machine designed to transfer wealth from the many to himself, and most of the victims didn't even know they'd been robbed yet. But Eleanor Briggs knew, and she was finally ready to act. She'd spent the winter months doing more than just collecting evidence. She'd been building alliances, carefully and quietly, reaching out to people she trusted, people she knew couldn't be in Jake's pocket. There was Harold Miller, the banker in Marshalltown, who'd been suspicious of some of the loan applications that had come through his institution. There was Marcus Webb, a lawyer from Des Moines who specialized in agricultural law and had sharp eyes for the kind of legal trickery Jake employed. And there was Sheriff Thomas Riley, a no-nonsense lawman who'd been a friend of Eleanor's late husband and who trusted her judgment. In the second week of April, Eleanor convened a meeting in the back room of Marshalltown's Oddfellows Hall. It was after hours, the building empty except for the 4 of them. She spread her notebooks across a table, along with copies of documents she'd obtained from the county courthouse, loan papers she'd convinced Harold Miller to share, and testimonials from farmers who'd begun to suspect they'd been taken for a ride. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, her voice steady and certain, "we have a problem named Jake Farrow." What followed was 3 hours of careful presentation. Eleanor laid out the pattern piece by piece, showing how seemingly unrelated transactions connected to form a comprehensive network of fraud. She demonstrated how Jake had used shell companies' businesses that existed only on paper, registered to false addresses or abandoned properties. She showed how he'd exploited gaps in county record keeping, filing documents in multiple jurisdictions to hide the true scope of his holdings. She revealed how he'd used associates like Samuel Price to create the appearance of legitimate third parties when really they were all working together. Harold Miller grew increasingly pale as Eleanor explained how Jake had used his bank's loans as part of the scheme, making the institution unwittingly complicit in the fraud. Marcus Webb filled page after page with notes, already seeing the legal angles, the arguments that would need to be made. Sheriff Rayleigh just got angry, the kind of cold anger that comes from realizing someone has made a fool of you and your entire community. "How much?" the sheriff finally asked. "How much has he stolen?" Eleanor consulted her notes. Conservatively, accounting for property value, cash transactions, and equipment, one estimates somewhere between $75,000 and $100,000. The silence that followed was profound. In 1923, in rural Iowa, that was a staggering sum. It was the combined annual income of dozens of families. It was generational wealth, life savings, the difference between security and destitution for scores of hard-working people. "We need to arrest him," Sheriff Riley said. "Today, right now." But Marcus Webb shook his head. "On what charges?" "Everything. Eleanor has shown us is suspicious, but Jake's been careful. Most of what he's done is technically legal immoral, yes, but legal. The contracts are real. The signatures are legitimate. He hasn't stolen anything in the traditional sense. He's defrauded people using the legal system itself." "So what do we do?" Harold Miller asked. "Just let him get away with it?" "No," Eleanor said. "We expose him. We make it public. We warn people before the final pieces of his plans fall into place. Marcus Webb considered this. It's risky. If we go public without solid criminal charges, Jake could sue for defamation. And if we tip our hand too early, he might just disappear with whatever he's already taken. So we need to be smart about it, Eleanor replied. We need to move fast enough that he can't escape, but carefully enough that we don't give him legal ammunition to fight back. They spent another hour crafting a plan. Marcus Webb would file civil complaints on behalf of several of the defrauded farmers, seeking injunctions to freeze Jake's assets and prevent him from transferring property. Harold Miller would review all of Jake's financial transactions through the bank, looking for any technical violations of banking regulations. Sheriff Riley would conduct a formal investigation into Jake's background, tracking down where he'd come from, whether he'd pulled similar schemes elsewhere. And Eleanor would write an article for the Marshalltown Times-Republican, laying out the pattern of fraud in a way that would warn the community without making claims they couldn't prove. It was a good plan. A solid plan. The kind of plan that might actually work. They agreed to move in 48 hours, giving everyone time to prepare their pieces. They shook hands, these four conspirators united in their determination to protect their community from a predator. What none of them knew was that they'd been overheard. Jake Farrow had survived this long not just because he was brilliant, but because he was paranoid. He maintained a network of informants, people who owed him money, people he'd helped out of jams, people who were in so deep with his schemes that they couldn't afford to see him fail. One of those people was a janitor at the Odd Fellows Hall, a man named Pete Daniels who'd lost half his farm in a bad deal and who Jake had rescued with a loan that came with strings attached. Pete had been cleaning the hall that evening when Eleanor and her group arrived. He'd seen them slip into the back room. He'd seen Eleanor's serious expression, the thick stack of papers she carried. And he'd found a way to position himself near enough to the door to hear most of what was said. 30 minutes after Eleanor's meeting ended, Pete was knocking on Jake Farrow's door. Jake lived in a modest farmhouse he rented on the outskirts of Gilman, a place that fit his carefully cultivated image as a simple man making his way in the world. But the simplicity was an illusion, just like everything else about him. Inside that farmhouse were filing cabinets full of documents, ledgers tracking every deal he'd made, cash hidden in false bottom drawers, and 2 packed bags ready to go at a moment's notice. Jake had always known this day might come. He'd planned for it the way he planned for everything else: multiple scenarios, multiple escape routes, contingencies for every contingency. He listened to Pete's breathless account of Eleanor's meeting, his expression never changing, his mind already working through the implications. They knew, maybe not everything, but enough. And they were going to move in 48 hours. That meant Jake had 47 hours to implement his exit strategy. He thanked Pete calmly, paid him $50 for the information, more money than Pete had seen in one place in years, and sent him on his way. Then Jake sat down at his kitchen table and started making lists. There were liquid assets to collect. There were documents to destroy. There were people who needed to be paid off or threatened into silence. There were final moves to make, last pieces of the con to complete before he vanished. And there was one more big score he could pull off before he left. One final masterpiece that would cement his legacy and set him up for years to come. The Brennan. Estate. Thomas Brennan had been one of the wealthiest landowners in Marshall County until his death the previous winter. He'd left behind 3,000 acres, a substantial fortune in livestock and equipment, and a complicated will that his 3 children were still fighting over. Jake had been cultivating a relationship with the eldest son, David, for months, positioning himself as a neutral mediator who could help resolve the family dispute. What David didn't know was that Jake had also been working with David's siblings, telling each of them slightly different stories, manipulating their suspicions, fanning the flames of their conflict. The goal was to get all 3 of them so desperate for resolution that they'd agree to sell the entire estate quickly, take the cash, and walk away from the headache. Jake had already lined up a buyer, another associate, another front, who would purchase the Brennan estate for 40 cents on the dollar, a fraction of its true value. The siblings would think they were getting a fair deal because they'd be so exhausted from fighting. And Jake's cut of the transaction would be $15,000, enough to disappear and start fresh somewhere else. The deal was scheduled to close in 10 days. But Jake didn't have 10 days anymore. He had to accelerate everything, push the Brennan children to sign immediately, collect his money, and get out before Eleanor and her allies could spring their trap. It was going to be close. Dangerously close. The kind of high-wire act that Jake normally avoided because the risks outweighed the rewards. But Jake Farrow hadn't gotten where he was by playing it safe. And he wasn't about to let some elderly widow and her amateur detective work rob him of his greatest triumph. Over the next 24 hours, Jake moved like a man possessed. He contacted David Brennan with an urgent message. The buyer was getting cold feet, threatening to walk away unless the deal closed immediately. He simultaneously contacted the other siblings with different urgent messages, each one designed to create panic and override their judgment. He arranged for the falsified documents to be prepared, for the bank transfers to be set up, for every piece of the elaborate machinery to fall into place. By the evening of the next day, with less than 24 hours before Eleanor planned to go public, Jake had it all arranged. The Brennan children would sign the papers the following morning. The money would transfer by noon. And by sunset, Jake Farrow would be on a train heading west with enough cash to last him a lifetime. But there was one thing Jake hadn't accounted for. One variable he couldn't control. Thomas Henderson, the first farmer Jake had conned, the man whose trust he'd exploited so completely, had finally pieced together what had happened to him. Not because he was smart, but because his banker, Harold Miller, had sat him down and walked him through the fraudulent contract line by line. Thomas had stared at those papers, at his own signature, at the legal language that had stolen his farm from under his feet, and something inside him had broken. He'd gone home to his wife Martha, and they'd held each other and cried. And then Martha Henderson had done what Jake should have expected, but somehow didn't. She'd gone to every farmer in the county she could reach, telling them what had happened, warning them about Jake Farrow, urging them to look closely at any deals they'd made with that friendly, helpful neighbor who always seemed to show up just when you needed him most. By the time Jake woke up on the morning of the Brennan signing, the entire county knew. Eleanor's carefully planned exposure had been overtaken by something more powerful, a victim speaking truth to her community, backed by the moral authority of genuine suffering. Jake got the first hint that something was wrong when he arrived. at the bank in Marshalltown for the Brennan closing and saw the crowd outside. 50 people, maybe more. Farmers, their wives. Harold Miller standing on the bank steps, reading from Eleanor Briggs's article. Sheriff Riley standing beside him, hand resting on his service weapon, and standing in the front of the crowd, holding hands, where Thomas and Martha Henderson. Jake Farrow stood across the street, hidden in the doorway of a general store, and watched his empire collapse in real time. He watched David Brennan arrive for the signing, see the crowd, hear the accusations, and turn pale as he realized he'd almost been the next victim. He watched Sheriff Riley enter the bank and emerge minutes later with the fake documents Jake had prepared. He'd lost. After 2 years of perfect execution, of brilliant schemes and flawless acting, he'd lost because he'd underestimated the power of community, the bonds of trust that held these people together even when they'd been betrayed. Jake watched for another minute, memorizing the scene, understanding that this was the end of something. Then he turned and walked away, moving quickly but not running, heading for the boarding house where his bags were packed and waiting. He had maybe an hour before they came looking for him. An hour to get to the train station, board the next westbound train, and disappear. It would have to be enough, because Jake Farrow was many things: a con man, a thief, a liar, a manipulator, but he was not a fool. He knew when to cut his losses and run. The only question was whether he'd make it out before the law closed in. Asterisk, the westbound train wasn't scheduled to leave until 2:15 in the afternoon, which gave Jake Farrow 90 minutes to become someone else entirely. He'd done it before in Wisconsin, in Illinois, in Missouri, shed one identity like a snake sheds skin and emerged as a completely different person. Names were just words. Histories were just stories. The only thing that mattered was the man you appeared to be in the moment, but this time felt different. This time, Jake could feel the walls closing in with an urgency he'd never experienced before. In previous escapes, he'd had days or even weeks of warning, time to methodically erase his tracks and construct new ones. Now he had barely enough time to grab his bags and run. He made it to the boarding house without incident, took the back stairs 2 at a time, and entered his room with the key already in hand. The 2 bags were exactly where he'd left them, packed with cash, documents under 3 different names, and enough clothes to maintain appearances for a few weeks until he could establish himself somewhere new. California, maybe. Or down to Mexico. Somewhere far from Iowa's endless corn and betrayed farmers and widows with notebooks full of evidence. Jake was reaching for the first bag when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, more than one person. Moving with purpose, he froze. Calculating, the window was too high for a clean escape. The door was the only way out, and if someone was coming up those stairs, they'd have him boxed in. His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, where he kept a small revolver he'd never fired in anger, but always carried for moments exactly like this one. Then a voice called out, "Mr. Farrow, Jake Farrow, this is Sheriff Riley. I need you to open this door and come out with your hands visible." Jake's mind raced through his options. Fight, impossible. They'd gun him down, and he wasn't a violent man by nature. Surrender? That meant facing charges, trial, almost certainly prison. A man like him wouldn't last long behind bars. Cons and thieves were one thing, but someone who'd preyed on farmers, on families. The other inmates would eat him alive. Run, but run where? Mr. Farrow, the sheriff's voice came again, harder this time. I know you're in there. I got Pete Daniels downstairs telling me you came in 5 minutes ago. You got no place to go. Let's do this the easy way. Of course Pete had betrayed him. Jake should have seen that coming. $50 bought you information, but it didn't buy you loyalty. Not in a town where Pete's neighbors had just found out they'd been robbed blind by the man he'd been helping. Jake took a deep breath and made his decision. He wasn't going through that door. Not to face Sheriff Riley. Not to face the crowd that had probably followed from the bank. Not to face Thomas Henderson's wounded eyes and Martha Henderson's tears. But he wasn't going to fight either. There was a third option, one he'd hoped never to use, but had always kept in reserve. The boarding house backed up to Keller's lumberyard, and beyond that was a warren of storage buildings and alleyways that Jake had mapped out months ago, back when he'd first decided to make Marshall County his hunting ground. If he could make it to that maze, he might be able to lose them long enough to find another way out of town. He moved quickly to the window, opened it as quietly as he could, and looked down, 15 feet to a shed roof. From there, another 6 feet to the ground. Doable if he was fast and lucky. Behind him, the sheriff was saying something else, but Jake wasn't listening anymore. He grabbed the first bag, the one with the cash and the most important documents, and threw it out the window. It landed on the shed roof with a thud that sounded deafening in the afternoon stillness. Then he climbed onto the windowsill, took one last look at the room that had been Jake Farrow's home for 2 years, and jumped. He hit the shed roof hard, rolled to absorb the impact, the way he'd learned as a kid jumping off barn roofs back when he still had a real name and a real history, before he'd become the ghost who haunted Farmlands. The second drop to the ground was easier. He scooped up the bag and ran. Behind him, he heard shouting. The window he'd just climbed through was now filled with Sheriff Riley's face, red with exertion and anger. "Farrow, goddammit, Farrow, stop!" But Jake was already gone, sprinting through the lumber yard, weaving between stacks of 2x4s and sheets of plywood, using the terrain he'd memorized for exactly this purpose. He could hear more shouting now, more people joining the chase. The whole damn town was probably after him. He made it to the alley behind the lumberyard, then cut left toward the warehouses that fronted the railroad tracks. If he could just reach those tracks, follow them north out of town, he might be able to hop a freight train or find a farmer's truck to steal. It was a terrible plan, improvised and desperate, but it was all he had. That's when he saw Eleanor Briggs. She was standing at the end of the alley, blocking his path, a small revolver in her hand. It wasn't pointed at him, just held at her side, but the message was clear. At 63 years old, this widow had positioned herself between a running criminal and his escape route, and she had no intention of moving. Jake skidded to a halt, breathing hard, the bag heavy in his hand. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the con man and the woman who'd exposed him, predator and protector, two people who'd each spent months studying the other from a distance. "Mrs. Briggs," Jake said, and even now, even in this moment, his voice had that quality of warmth and sincerity that had fooled so many people. I don't want any trouble. Then you shouldn't have come to Marshall County, Eleanor replied. Her voice was steady, her hand on the gun unwavering. You shouldn't have stolen from my neighbors. You shouldn't have looked Thomas Henderson in the chew. You shouldn't have looked Thomas Henderson in the tinging. While you robbed him of everything he'd worked his whole life to build. It was just business, Jake said. Nothing personal. Eleanor's expression hardened. Everything is personal when you're stealing people's lives. Behind Jake, the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Sheriff Riley and his deputies, probably. Some townspeople, too, all converging on this alley. In seconds, they'd have him surrounded. Jake looked at Eleanor, at the gun in her hand, at the determination in her eyes. He thought about trying to talk his way past her, to use the charm and manipulation that had served him so well for so long. He thought about trying to rush her, to bet that a 63-year-old woman wouldn't actually pull the trigger. But, looking at Eleanor Briggs, Jake Farrow knew the truth. This woman had hunted him with the same patience and skill he'd used to hunt his victims. She'd studied him, learned him, predicted him. And she'd beaten him at his own game. They'll put me away for years, Jake said quietly. You know that, right? For what I've done. I'll die in prison. Yes, Eleanor said simply. You probably will. Jake nodded slowly. He set down the bag. Then he raised his hands, palms out, in. A gesture of surrender. Sheriff Riley and 3 deputies rounded the corner 30 seconds later, guns drawn, ready for a fight. What they found was Jake Farrow standing quietly with his hands up and Eleanor Briggs with her revolver still at her side. And between them, a moment of understanding that transcended words. They handcuffed Jake roughly, not gentle about it, and Sheriff Riley personally picked up the bag Jake had dropped. He opened it right there in the alley, and the gathered crowd, because of course a crowd had formed, murmured as they saw the bundles of cash, the multiple identity documents, the evidence of a man who'd been planning to disappear. How much? Someone in the crowd called out. The sheriff did a quick count. Looks like maybe 20,000 here. There's probably more wherever he was keeping it. 20,000 of our money, another voice said. And there was an ugly tone to it now. A mob mentality starting to form. Jake could feel it in the air. The shift from justice to vengeance, from arrest to lynching. These were good people, mostly, but he'd hurt them in ways that went beyond money. He'd violated their trust, their sense of community, their belief that their rural isolation protected them from the kinds of predators that prowled cities. Sheriff Riley felt it too. All right, that's enough, he said loudly, projecting authority. This man is under arrest. He'll face trial, proper and legal. We're not a lynch mob. We're better than that. He turned to Jake. Come on. Let's get you locked up before I can't guarantee your safety. They marched him through the streets of Marshalltown, a perp walk before the term had been invented, with half the town lining the sidewalks to watch Jake Farrow's final parade. Some people shouted. Some people cried. Some just stared in silence, trying to reconcile the helpful neighbor they'd known with the criminal being led to jail in handcuffs. Jake kept his head up, maintained his dignity. It was all he had left. The county jail was a squat brick building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. They processed him efficiently, fingerprints, photographs, personal effects inventoried and stored. The cell they put him in was maybe 6 by 8 feet, with a cot and a bucket and bars that turned the afternoon sunlight into striped shadows on the floor. Jake sat on the cot and finally, for the first time in years, let himself stop performing. No charm, no manipulation, no mask. Just a tired man in a cell, facing the consequences of his choices. Over the next few days, the full scope of Jake's crimes began to emerge. Sheriff Riley found the other bag at the boarding house containing another $15,000 in cash and more documents. They located Jake's real name, Jacob Farragut, wanted in Wisconsin for fraud, suspected in Illinois and Missouri of similar schemes. They found the network of associates, including Samuel Price, who'd fled to Kansas but would eventually be caught. They uncovered fake companies and shell corporations and a web of deceit that had taken 2 years to construct and would take months to fully untangle. Marcus Webb, the lawyer from Des Moines, began the painful process of trying to make the victims whole. Some of the money was recovered. Some property could be returned. But the process was slow and imperfect, and many people would never fully recover what they'd lost. The trial, when it finally came in August of 1923, was almost anticlimactic. Jake Farrow, or Jacob Farragut, as the court called him, pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud. There was no point in fighting it. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, the verdict foreordained. The judge, a stern man named Henry Blackwood, who'd presided over Marshall County's legal affairs for 20 years, listened to the arguments for sentencing. The prosecution wanted the maximum, 20 years. The defense, a young lawyer appointed by the court because Jake had no money left for a real attorney, argued for mercy. Maybe 10 years, given his cooperation and guilty plea. Judge Blackwood took less than 5 minutes to decide. "Mr. Farragut," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every farmer who'd been robbed, every family that had been betrayed. "You came to this county and exploited the very qualities that make it good: trust, neighborliness, the willingness to help one another. You turned our virtues into weapons against us. In all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen crimes so calculated and so cruel." He paused, and the courtroom was absolutely silent. "I sentence you to 18 years in the Iowa State Penitentiary at Fort Madison, and I will recommend to the parole board that you serve every single day of that sentence." Jacob heard the words without expression. 18 years. He'd be 50 years old when he got out, if he lasted that long. Prison was hard on con men. Hard on men who'd made their living by making fools of others. They led him out of the courtroom in chains, and as he passed through the gallery, he saw Eleanor Briggs sitting in the back row. Their eyes met one last time, and Jake gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Predator to predator. One who'd won, one who'd lost. Eleanor didn't nod back, but something in her expression suggested she understood. That in another life, under different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than enemies. Two smart people who knew how to read others, how to plan, how to execute. But in this life, in this moment, she was the protector and he was the predator, and justice, for once, had come out on the right side. Jake Farrow disappeared into the prison system, and Marshall County began the long process of healing. But the wounds he'd inflicted, financial, emotional, psychological, would take years to fully scar over. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. And in the quiet nights, when farmers sat on their porches and watched the stars, some of them couldn't help but wonder how many other Jake Farrows were out there, moving through the world, wearing friendly faces, waiting for their chance to strike. It was a question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Iowa State Penitentiary at Fort Madison stood on the banks of the Mississippi River like a monument to man's capacity for both judgment and cruelty. Built in the 1830s from limestone quarried by the very prisoners it would house, the fortress-like structure had thick walls, narrow windows, and the kind of permanence that suggested it would outlast empires. For the men confined within those walls, time moved differently, slower, heavier, measured not in days but in the small degradations that accumulated into years. Jacob Farragut, formerly known as Jake Farrow, entered Fort Madison in September of 1923 wearing prison grays and the number 4782. The man who'd spent 2 years cultivating an identity, building trust, and manipulating an entire county now had no identity at all beyond those 4 digits. The first weeks were the hardest. Prison had its own social structure, its own rules and hierarchies, and new inmates had to find their place quickly or risk becoming victims themselves. Jake had certain advantages. He was intelligent, observant, and had spent his entire adult life reading people and situations. But he also had disadvantages. He was a con man in a population that despised con men, a man who'd stolen from farmers and families at a time when most of the prisoners came from exactly those backgrounds. Word of his crimes had preceded him. Stories had been in all the Iowa newspapers. Jake Farrow, the bandit of the Farmlands, the ghost who stole Marshall County, the con man who'd betrayed an entire community's trust. These stories made for sensational headlines, but they also made Jake a target. The first attack came on his 9th day inside. 3 inmates cornered him in the laundry facility, and their intentions were clear from their expressions. Jake took a beating that broke 2 ribs and left him with a face so swollen he couldn't see out of his left eye for a week. The guards broke it up eventually, but not quickly. They let it go on long enough to make a point. In Fort Madison, you were alone unless you made yourself valuable. So Jake adapted the way he'd always adapted. He couldn't use charm anymore, not in a place where everyone knew what he was, where his reputation preceded him and poisoned any attempt at manipulation. But he could use his brain. He could make himself useful in other ways. He started by helping illiterate inmates write letters to their families. Then he began advising men on their appeals, reading through legal documents, finding the loopholes and technicalities that might shorten their sentences. He became the prison's unofficial lawyer, the man who could navigate the Byzantine legal system that kept them all locked away. It was a con of sorts, but an honest one. Jake wasn't stealing anything anymore. He was trading knowledge for protection, intelligence for safety. And slowly, grudgingly, the other inmates began to accept him. Not as a friend, never as a friend, but as a resource, a tool to be used. The years passed with glacial slowness. 1924 became 1925, became 1926. Jake turned 35 behind bars, then 36, then 37. The world outside continued without him. He heard fragments of it through newspapers and new arrivals. Prohibition was in full swing. Gangsters were running wild in Chicago. The economy was booming. And somewhere out there, the farmers of Marshall, county were planting and harvesting, struggling and surviving, slowly rebuilding what he'd broken. He tried not to think about them. Tried not to think about Thomas Henderson's face, or Martha's tears, or Eleanor Briggs's steady gaze. Tried not to calculate how much money he'd stolen, how many lives he'd damaged, how many futures he'd compromised. That way lay madness, and Jake needed to stay sane if he was going to survive 18 years in this place. But some nights, lying on his narrow cot in a cell he shared with 2 other men, Jake couldn't help but wonder, had it been worth it? The money was gone, confiscated, or returned to victims. The freedom was gone, traded for a cell and a number. The only thing he'd really accomplished was to make himself infamous, to become a cautionary tale. A story parents told their children about what happens when you lie and steal and betray trust. It wasn't the legacy he'd imagined when he was young and ambitious and convinced he was smarter than everyone else. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing in ways Jake could barely comprehend. The roaring 20s gave way to the catastrophic crash of 1929. The Great Depression swept across America like a plague, and suddenly everyone was desperate. Everyone was struggling. Everyone was one bad season away from losing everything. In a twisted way, Jake thought. The rest of the country was finally experiencing what he'd inflicted on Marshall County 6 years earlier. The sudden collapse of everything you'd counted on. The betrayal of systems you trusted. The realization that security was an illusion. And tomorrow could strip you of everything you had today. He heard about it through new prisoners. Men who'd turned to crime because legitimate work had dried up, because banks had failed, because farms had been foreclosed. Some of these men knew his story, recognized his name from the old newspaper articles. They'd come from Iowa, from farms and small towns, and they'd heard about the ghost of Marshall County. One man, a young kid maybe 22 years old named Danny Chun, sat down next to Jake in the mess hall one evening in 1931. Danny was half white, half Chinese, from a farm family outside Des Moines, and he'd gotten 5 years for robbing a general store to feed his siblings after their parents died. "You're Jake Farrow," Danny said. It wasn't a question. "That was a long time ago," Jake replied, not looking up from his food. "My dad knew some of the people you robbed. The Hendersons, I think. Or maybe the Carmichaels. He always said you were the worst kind of thief, the kind that makes you stop trusting your neighbors." Jake finally looked at the kid. "Your father was right." Danny seemed surprised by the admission. "You sorry for it?" Jake considered the question. Was he sorry? He'd had 8 years to think about it. 8 years to watch how his crimes rippled outward, how the betrayal of trust poisoned entire communities. He'd had 8 years to understand that what he'd done wasn't just theft. It was a kind of murder, killing something invisible but essential. The belief that people were fundamentally good, that neighbors helped neighbors. That trust was a foundation you could build a life on. "Yeah," Jake said finally, "I'm sorry for it." "Not that sorry makes a damn bit of difference to anyone." Danny nodded slowly. "My dad also said that after you got caught, people in Marshall County started locking their doors at night. Started drawing up contracts for deals that used to be done on a handshake. Started suspecting everyone who came through offering to help. He said you didn't just steal their money. You stole the way they lived." "I know," Jake said quietly. They sat in silence for a while. Two prisoners from different generations, connected by the long shadow of Jake Farrow's crimes. So what happened to them? Jake asked. The Hendersons, do you know? Danny shrugged. Last I heard, they got some of their land back. Not all of it, but some. Took them years to recover. Their kids grew up different, my dad said. Harder, less trusting. Jake nodded. He'd expected as much. That was the real price of what he'd done, not the money he'd stolen, but the innocence he'd destroyed. You couldn't put a dollar value on that. You couldn't calculate the cost of making children grow up harder, of teaching people that trust was for fools. What about Eleanor Briggs? Jake asked. The woman who caught me. You hear anything about her? She died, Danny said. 2 years ago, heart gave out. But before she did, she wrote a book about what you did. Published it herself, handed out copies at county fairs and church meetings. Called it The Price of Trust or something like that. Used your story to warn people about con men and fraud schemes. Jake absorbed this information. Eleanor Briggs still fighting him even in death, still using him as a cautionary tale. He should have been angry, but instead he felt something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. She'd understood him better than anyone, had outplayed him in the end, and had made sure the lessons of his crimes outlived them both. Good for her, Jake said, and meant it. The Depression ground on. President Hoover was replaced by Roosevelt. The New Deal began reshaping America's relationship with government and safety nets. And inside Fort Madison, Jake Farrow continued to exist day by day, year by year, becoming less of a man and more of a ghost, even within the prison walls. By 1935, he'd been inside for 12 years. He was 44 years old, but looked 60. Prison aged you fast. The bad food, the stress, the violence, the soul-crushing monotony of captivity. He'd watched men go insane, watched them die, watched them give up and stop being human before their bodies stopped functioning. Jake was determined not to become one of them. He kept his mind sharp by reading everything he could get his hands on: law books, novels, newspapers, anything with words. He helped younger inmates navigate the system. He'd even started teaching a literacy class, approved by the warden because it kept the prison population manageable and productive. In a strange way, Jake Farrow had become a productive member of society. Just not the society outside the walls. He became eligible for parole in 1938 after serving 15 years. The parole board consisted of 3 stone-faced men who'd seen every sob story, every fake reformation, every desperate plea that prisoners could manufacture. Jake didn't try to con them. He'd learned that lesson. Instead, he told them the truth. I was a thief and a con man, he said. I destroyed people's lives for money. I'm not going to tell you I'm reformed or that I've found God or any of that. What I will tell you is that I'm 50 years old, I'm tired, and if you let me out, I'm going to find some quiet corner of the world and disappear into it. I'm done fighting. I'm done scheming. I just want to finish whatever time I've got left without bars between me and the sky. The parole board members looked at each other. Then the chairman spoke. Mr. Farragut, Judge Blackwood recommended you serve your full sentence. He said you were one of the most calculating criminals he'd ever seen. Why should we go against his recommendation? Because Judge Blackwood was right, Jake said. I was calculating. I was dangerous. But that man died. In here about 5 years ago, what's left is just tired. They denied his parole. Recommended he served the full 18 years. Jake returned to his cell and didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't react. He'd known it was a long shot. Violent criminals got paroled earlier than con men because violence could be chalked up to passion, to momentary loss of control. But premeditated fraud, calculated betrayal, those crimes spoke to something colder, something that scared people more than simple violence. So Jake waited. 1938 became 1939, became 1940. War broke out in Europe. And then America joined it, and suddenly the world was focused on bigger criminals than a small-time con man from Iowa. Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo, those were the names that filled the newspapers now. Jake Farrow was forgotten, a footnote to a smaller, simpler time. On September 14th, 1941, a guard came to Jake's cell at dawn. "Farragut," he said, "pack your things, you're done." Jake looked up from his cot, confused. "What? Your sentence is up. 18 years served in full. You're released today." Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting. He was 50 years old and felt 70. He'd entered prison as a vigorous man in his prime and was leaving as something broken and worn. He had no things to pack, really. A few books. A couple of letters from a distant cousin who'd written him sporadically over the years. The clothes he'd worn into Fort Madison were long gone, so they gave him a cheap suit that didn't fit right and $20 seed money to help him start over. 2 hours later, Jacob Farragut walked out through the gates of Fort Madison into a world that had changed beyond recognition. It was 1941. America was on the brink of entering a world war. The Depression was ending. Technology had advanced. And Jake Farrow, the ghost of Marshall County, the bandit of the Farmlands, was a relic from a different era. He stood outside the prison gates, breathing air that didn't taste like confinement, and tried to decide where to go. Not back to Marshall County, certainly. Not to any place where people might remember his name or his crimes. He needed to disappear completely, to find some anonymous corner of America and fade into it like fog burning off in morning sun. Bus was leaving for Omaha in an hour. From there, he could head west. California, maybe. Los Angeles was supposed to be full of people trying to be someone they weren't. He'd fit right in. Jake bought a ticket with 5 of his $20 and sat in the bus station, waiting. Around him, people moved with purpose, soldiers heading to basic training, families traveling to see relatives one last time before the war scattered them. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do, someone who cared whether they arrived. Jake Farrow had none of those things. He was truly free in the worst possible sense. Free of connections, free of obligations, free of anyone caring whether he lived or died. The bus arrived. Jake boarded, found a seat in the back, and pressed his face against the window as the vehicle pulled away from Fort Madison. He watched the prison disappear behind him, watched the Mississippi River slide past, watched Iowa spread out in all its flat, fertile glory. Somewhere out there, Marshall County continued without him. The Hendersons were probably still farming, older now, their children grown. The Carmichaels had either recovered or been destroyed. He'd never know which. Eleanor Briggs was in her grave, but her book lived on, warning new generations about Men like him and Jake Farrow, the ghost who'd haunted Farmlands, had finally become what he'd always pretended to be. Nobody in particular, a man without a past or a future. Just another American trying to survive in a world that had moved on without him. The bus rolled west into an uncertain future, carrying a prisoner who was finally free and a free man who would always be imprisoned by what he'd done. Asterisk Los Angeles. In 1942 was a city transforming itself into something new and strange. The war had pulled men away and drawn women into the workforce. The aircraft factories ran 3 shifts a day, building bombers and fighters for the Pacific Theater. The streets were full of sailors on leave, defense workers flush with overtime, pay, and refugees from every corner of America seeking new lives in California's endless sunshine. Jake Farrow, though he no longer used that name, disappeared into this chaos like a drop of water into the ocean. He'd taken a new identity from a tombstone in an Omaha cemetery. A man named William Harper, who died as a child in 1894. With 50 years of life experience and 18 years of prison education in how the system worked, Jake had managed to construct a plausible paper trail for William Harper. A driver's license, a draft exemption, too old, plus a fabricated medical condition, and a social security card obtained through channels that didn't ask too many questions. William Harper found work as a night watchman at a warehouse in Long Beach. It was simple work, lonely work, the kind of job where nobody asked about your past because they didn't care. You showed up, walked your routes, checked your watch points, and collected a paycheck every Friday. It wasn't much money, but it was honest money, and that was something Jake Farrow had never earned before. He lived in a boarding house on 7th Street, a cramped room with a hot plate and a shared bathroom down the hall. His neighbors were merchant sailors, elderly pensioners, and worn-out men who'd also come to California hoping to escape whatever they'd left behind. Nobody asked questions. Nobody got too friendly. It was perfect for a man who needed to be nobody. But being nobody was harder than Jake had expected. For 20 years, he'd been someone. A con man, yes, but a brilliant one. A manipulator, certainly, but one who'd orchestrated schemes of impressive complexity. Even in prison, he'd had an identity. Inmate 4782, the literacy teacher, the jailhouse lawyer. He'd been someone people came to, someone who served a function. Now, he was just another old man in a city full of old men who'd washed up on California's shores like driftwood. He had no friends because he didn't dare make friends. No family because he'd burned those bridges decades ago. No purpose beyond the mechanical routine of his watchman rounds. The loneliness ate at him in ways 18 years of prison never had. In Fort Madison, he'd been surrounded by people, even if they were enemies or temporary allies. Here, in the middle of millions, he was completely alone. He started spending his off hours in public libraries, partly because they were free and partly because books had always been his escape. He read everything: newspapers, novels, histories, whatever the library had available. And slowly, inevitably, he began reading about Iowa. The war had changed farming. Government subsidies and new technology had made agriculture more productive than ever. The Depression's wounds were healing as farmers produced food for the war effort. And Marshall County, specifically, was thriving. Jake found articles about record harvests, about communities coming together for war bond drives, about young men from small Iowa towns distinguishing themselves in combat. He read about Thomas Henderson's son enlisting in the Marines, about the Carmichael daughter becoming a nurse in the Army. He read about how Marshall County had become a model for agricultural production, how techniques developed there were being taught across the Midwest. What he didn't read about. What he searched for but couldn't find was any mention of how his crimes still affected them. Had they forgiven? Had they forgotten? Had the trauma faded, or did it still lurk beneath the surface, poisoning trust even as the community flourished? Jake would never know. And that, he realized, was perhaps the truest punishment. Not the 18 years behind bars, but this eternal wondering about the lives he'd damaged, the wondering without the possibility of answers. One evening in the spring of 1943, Jake was walking home from the library when he passed a church having some kind of social event. Music and laughter spilled out into the street, and Jake stopped despite himself, drawn by the sound of community, of belonging, of the kind of life he'd observed from the outside but never truly joined. A priest was standing at the door, greeting people as they arrived. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind face of someone who'd chosen service over self. He noticed Jake standing on the sidewalk and smiled. "Evening, friend. You're welcome to join us. It's just a potluck, nothing fancy. Good food and good company." Jake shook his head automatically. "I'm not Catholic." "Neither are half the people here," the priest replied cheerfully. "We're not picky about denomination when it comes to fried chicken and potato salad. Come on in. You look like you could use a warm meal and some conversation." And before Jake could formulate another excuse, he found himself being gently shepherded inside, into a church basement full of tables and laughter and people who looked genuinely happy to be together. Someone put a plate in his hands. Someone else asked his name. He said, "William Harper," and the lie tasted like ash in his mouth, but it was the only name he could give. A widow named Mrs. Chun, no relation to the Danny Chun from prison, but the coincidence made Jake's heart skip. Insisted on loading his plate with food. A young couple told him about their new baby. An elderly man complained about the rationing, but did so with a smile that suggested he didn't really mind sacrificing for the war effort. It was everything Jake had pretended to be part of in Marshall County, but had never actually experienced. These people weren't marks or targets. They were just humans being human, finding joy in small moments, supporting each other through hard times, building the kind of community that made life bearable. Jake stayed for 2 hours, mostly listening, occasionally offering a comment or a smile. And when he finally left, thanking the priest and Mrs. Chun and walking back to his lonely room, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades: regret. Not the abstract regret of knowing he'd done wrong, but the sharp, specific regret of understanding exactly what he'd destroyed in Marshall County. He'd stolen their ability to have nights like this without suspicion lurking in the corners. He'd made it harder for them to trust, to open their homes, to believe that the friendly stranger might actually just be friendly. He'd poisoned the well of community by proving that even the most helpful neighbor might be a predator in disguise. That night, Jake sat at his small desk and did something he'd never done before. He wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, he couldn't risk that, but just to write. Words on paper. To try to articulate something he'd never been able to say. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve it. What I did was monstrous not because of the money can be replaced, but because of the trust. Trust, once broken, leaves scars that last generations. Children who grew up watching their parents be betrayed learn to be suspicious. Communities that were open become closed. The ripples of betrayal spread far beyond the initial crime. I spent 18 years in prison, but that wasn't the punishment. The punishment is knowing that somewhere in Iowa there are people who still lock their doors because of me, who still hesitate before helping a stranger because of me, who still carry the weight of my betrayal even though they've probably forgotten my name. I can't undo what I did. I can't give back what I stole, not the money, and certainly not the innocence. All I can do is promise that William Harper, whoever he is, will be a better man than Jake Farrow ever was. It's not much. It's not enough, but it's all I have." He sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to nobody and put it in his desk drawer. It would never be sent because there was nobody to send it to. But writing it had mattered somehow, had forced him to confront truths he'd spent decades avoiding. Jake continued his routine: work, library, his lonely room. But he also started going to that church's weekly potlucks. He became a regular, a familiar face, though he never shared much about himself. William Harper was a quiet man with a mysterious past, but he was reliable and polite, and eventually people stopped asking questions. He helped Mrs. Chun with her shopping when her arthritis got bad. He taught some of the younger kids how to play chess. He contributed what little money he could to the church's war relief fund. Small things, insignificant things. Nothing that could balance the scales of what he'd done, but something that made William Harper's existence feel slightly less empty than Jake Farrow's had been. The war ended in 1945. The boys came home, most of them, anyway. The factories retooled for peacetime production. California exploded with growth as millions of veterans decided to stay in the Golden State rather than return to wherever they'd come from. Jake was 54 now, an old man by standards of his generation, worn down by hard years and harder choices. His health was declining. The prison years had taken their toll, and the wartime diet of rationing hadn't helped. He had pains in his chest that he ignored because he couldn't afford doctors and because, honestly, part of him welcomed the idea of an early exit. But he kept going, kept working his night watchman rounds, kept attending his weekly potlucks, kept being William Harper, the quiet man with the mysterious past who'd found a small place in a small community. In 1947, on a warm October evening, Jake was walking home from the church when he saw something that stopped him cold. A young woman, maybe 25, with two small children, standing on the sidewalk looking lost and overwhelmed. She had an Iowa accent. He'd recognize it anywhere, and she was asking passers-by for directions to a boarding house. Jake hesitated. Everything in his nature told him to walk past, to not engage, to not risk the exposure that might come from helping someone who might have connections to his past. But William Harper wouldn't walk past. William Harper would help. "Excuse me," Jake said, approaching carefully. "I'm sorry for eavesdropping, but I heard you asking about a boarding house. Are you new to Los Angeles?" The woman turned to him, relief evident on her face. "Yes, sir. Just arrived today from Iowa. My husband's starting a job at the Douglas plant, and we're trying to find somewhere to stay until we can afford a proper place." "Iowa," Jake said, his heart pounding. "Whereabouts?" "Marshall County, near Marshalltown. Do you know it?" Jake's mouth went dry. Of all the people, of all the places, of all the impossible coincidences, I've heard of it, he managed. "Nice. Country out there. Beautiful country," the woman agreed. "Though maybe I'm biased. My family's been farming there for 3 generations. The Hendersons, maybe you've heard of them." Time seemed to stop. Jake was looking at Thomas and Martha Henderson's granddaughter, standing in front of him on a Los Angeles sidewalk, asking for help from the man who'd destroyed her grandparents' lives. He could walk away, should walk away. Every instinct screamed at him to make an excuse and disappear before the universe's cruel joke became even crueler, but he didn't. "Let me help you," Jake said quietly. "I know the area. I can show you where some of the better boarding houses are, the ones that take families." The woman smiled, trusting him immediately the way people had trusted Jake Farrow 25 years earlier in Marshall County. "That's so kind of you, Mr. Harper," Jake said. William Harper. He spent the next hour helping the Henderson girl. He couldn't think of her any other way. Find a suitable place to stay. He made sure they got a fair price, made sure that landlord understood they were good people who'd pay their rent on time. And when the young mother thanked him profusely, tears in her eyes because California had seemed so overwhelming until this kind stranger had appeared, Jake felt something break inside him. This was his chance at redemption. Not the big, dramatic kind. Just this small moment, helping the granddaughter of a man he'd wronged, making sure she landed safely in a city that chewed up and spit out people who weren't careful. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. As Jake walked home that night, the pains in his chest were stronger than usual, and he knew his time was running short. But for the first time in decades, he felt like maybe, just maybe, William Harper's life meant something more than just penance for Jake Farrow's sins. He was wrong about the redemption. Of course, there was no redemption for what he'd done. No way to balance those scales. But perhaps that was okay. Perhaps the point wasn't redemption, but simply being better. Doing better, one small act at a time until the final act came. The ghost of Marshall County would haunt him until the day he died. But maybe, just maybe, the ghost of William Harper would haunt these California streets with something resembling grace. Winter came to Los Angeles in 1949. Though calling it winter was generous. The temperature dropped into the 50s at night. The rain came more frequently, and the locals complained as if they lived in Minnesota instead of Southern California. But for Jake Farrow William Harper, who'd spent his formative years in the Midwest, it barely registered as weather at all. He was 58 years old now, though he looked and felt closer to 70. The pains in his chest had become constant companions, and his breathing was labored enough that he'd had to give up the night watchman job 6 months earlier. He lived on a small pension and some assistance from the church, supplemented by odd jobs he could still manage, filing papers for a lawyer's office, sweeping floors at the library, anything that let him contribute something to his own survival. The Henderson girl, though she was hardly a girl anymore, being a mother of 3, now had become a regular at the same church. Her husband worked long shifts at the aircraft plant, and she'd found community among the other women whose husbands worked similar hours. Jake watched her from a distance, this living link to his past, and marveled at the universe's sense of irony. She didn't know who he was, of course. Why would she? Jake Farrow was a story her grandparents might have mentioned, a cautionary tale from before she was born, a ghost from a different era. To her, William Harper was just the nice elderly man who'd helped her when she first arrived in California, who sometimes babysat her kids, who taught her oldest boy how to tie proper knots. It was the closest thing to family Jake had experienced in 30 years, and it was built entirely on a lie. That lie began to weigh on him more heavily as his health declined. He'd started coughing blood in November, and the charity doctor who saw him delivered news that wasn't really news. His lungs were damaged, probably from the prison years, and his heart was weak. He had months, maybe a year if he was lucky. No treatment could change that arithmetic. Jake accepted the diagnosis with the same calm he'd learned in Fort Madison. Death had been coming for everyone since the moment they were born. His was just arriving a bit sooner than others, and after the life he'd lived. He had no real complaints about that the lie bothered him. After everything, after all the years of trying to be better as William Harper, the foundation was still fraudulent. He'd built something decent on a foundation of deception, and the irony wasn't lost on him. In December, Jake wrote another letter. This one, unlike the letter from 1943, had a specific recipient. "Dear Mrs. Henderson," he wrote, using her married name since he didn't know it, addressing it to her California residence. "You know me as William Harper, the man who helped you find a boarding house when you first arrived in Los Angeles. But that's not my real name, and I'm not who you think I am. My name is Jacob Farragut, though I went by Jake Farrow when I lived in Marshall County, Iowa. In the early 1920s, I'm the man who defrauded your grandparents and many others in that community. I'm the reason your family's farm was nearly lost. The reason trust became harder in that place. The reason people learned to lock their doors and question their neighbors' motives. I spent 18 years in prison for my crimes, and I've spent the years since trying to be someone better. When I helped you in 1947, I didn't know who you were at first. When I learned you were a Henderson, I should have walked away. Instead, I chose to help anyway. Not because it would earn redemption. I don't believe in redemption for what I did, but because William Harper, whoever he is, would have helped. I'm writing this letter now because I'm dying, and I don't want to leave behind another lie. You've welcomed me into your life, your children's lives, and you deserve to know the truth about who you've been trusting. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't want it. What I want is for you to know that your grandparents were good people who didn't deserve what I did to them, and that their legacy lives on in you and your children. I want you to know that the trust they rebuilt after I destroyed it, the community they repaired after I poisoned it, was a greater achievement than any crime I ever committed. And I want you to know that if there's any good in William Harper, any small grace in these last years, it came from trying to be what I pretended to be in your grandparents' community, a decent human being who helps his neighbors without ulterior motives. I failed at that in Marshall County. I think I did slightly better in Los Angeles, though the failure is what defines me, not the belated attempt at decency. Tell your grandparents' story to your children. Make sure they know what I did and why it mattered and how trust is something precious that should never be traded for convenience or profit. Let my life be the cautionary tale it was always meant to be. Yours in shame and sorrow, Jacob Farragut, William Harper. He sealed the letter, addressed it, and put it in his desk drawer next to the unsent letter from 1943. He didn't mail it immediately. He wanted to think about it, to make sure this was the right thing to do. Was it fair to burden her with this knowledge? To take away the memory of the helpful old man who'd been kind to her family? To replace that innocuous figure with the monster who'd terrorized her grandparents' generation? But fairness, Jake realized, had never been the point. The truth was the point. And after a lifetime of lies, he owed anyone the truth. On Christmas Eve, 1949, the church held a special service and potluck. Jake attended, though he was so weak now that Mrs. Chun had to drive him there. He sat in the back, watching. Families celebrate together, watching children perform a pageant about hope and redemption and new beginnings. The Henderson girl, her name was Sarah, he'd learned was there with her husband and 3 kids. The oldest boy, maybe 8 years old now, saw Jake and waved enthusiastically. Sarah smiled and brought the boy over. Mr. Harper, Tommy wanted to show you the model ship he built using those knots you taught him. Jake looked at the carefully constructed model, at the properly tied rigging, at the pride on the boy's face. That's fine work, Tommy. Really fine. You've got a steady hand and good patience. Those are valuable qualities. Will you teach me more knots after Christmas? Tommy asked. Dad says there's hundreds of different kinds. Jake glanced up at Sarah, seeing the trust in her eyes, the warmth of someone who considered him a friend of the family. Then he looked back at Tommy, at this innocent child who had no idea he was talking to the man who'd once destroyed his great-grandparents' lives. I'd like that, Jake said quietly. But I might not be feeling well enough for much longer. I'm getting pretty old, you know. You're not that old, Tommy protested with the absolute certainty of childhood. Jake smiled despite himself. Well, I'm old enough. But I'll teach you what I can while I can. Deal, deal, deal. After they walked away, Jake sat alone with his thoughts. He'd spent decades trying to understand the calculus of harm he'd caused, trying to figure out if any good. He did as William Harper could somehow offset the evil Jake Farrow had committed, but he'd been asking the wrong question. It wasn't about offsetting or balancing or redemption. It was about this. At the end, who did you want to be? What did you want your last act to mean? Jake knew his answer now. Whatever time he had left, he would spend being kind to that boy, teaching him knots and maybe other things, lessons about trust and honesty and the importance of being who you claim to be. Not because it would save Jake's soul or earn him forgiveness, but because Tommy deserved better than another adult lying to him. When he got home that night, Jake took the letter from his desk drawer. He held it for a long time, reading and rereading it, considering all the implications. Then he put it in. A new envelope addressed to Sarah Henderson, but instead of mailing it immediately, he added a note, to be opened after my death. Give to Sarah Henderson, or, if she cannot be found, to be read at my funeral service if anyone bothers to hold one. He gave the letter to Father Michael, the priest who'd first invited him into the church community 7 years ago. Promise me, you'll make sure this gets to her or gets read publicly after I'm gone. Promise me the truth will come out, one way or another. Father Michael took the letter, his expression troubled. William, what's in this letter? My real name, Jake said. Simply, and my real history. I've lied to everyone here, Father, including you. This letter explains why. I don't expect forgiveness from God or anyone else. I just want the truth to be told when I can't tell it myself anymore. William, my name is Jacob, Jake interrupted gently. Jacob Farragut. And I was a criminal, and a betrayer, and a destroyer of trust. William Harper was an attempt to be something better, but he was always a fiction. I want the fiction to die with me, and the truth to survive me. Can you do that? Father Michael looked at the envelope, then back at Jake. The church believes in confession and absolution, Jacob. Whatever you've done, God can forgive. Maybe God can, Jake said. But I can't forgive myself, and the people I hurt can't forgive me, because most of them don't even know William Harper was the man who hurt them. This letter is the closest thing to confession I can manage. Will you hold on to it? The priest nodded slowly. I will. But Jacob, thank you for telling me. And thank you for being William Harper, even if you think he was a fiction. Fiction or not, he did real good for real people. Jake smiled sadly. That's kind of you to say, Father. But we both know that doing good after doing evil doesn't balance the scales. It just means you stopped adding to the evil, that's all. January came, and with it the end. Jake's breathing became more labored. The coughing fits more frequent. He spent his last week in the charity hospital, a place that smelled of disinfectant and resignation, where old men without families came to die. Sarah Henderson visited him there, bringing Tommy and the younger children. They'd made him cards, crude drawings of ships and knots and messages like, "Get well soon, Mr. Harper." Jake looked at those cards and felt tears he didn't try to hide. "You're a good mother," he told Sarah. "Your grandparents would be proud of how you've raised these children." Sarah looked puzzled. "You knew my grandparents?" Jake smiled. "No, but I heard stories. Everyone in Marshall County knew the Hendersons. Good people, survivors, the kind of folks who made Iowa what it was." She seemed pleased by this, never suspecting that the old man in the hospital bed knew far more about her family history than he was saying. Tommy showed him one more ship he'd built, and Jake mustered the energy to admire it properly. "You keep practicing," he told the boy. "And remember, the important thing about knots isn't just that they hold, it's that you can untie them when you need to. That's what makes them useful." It was perhaps the most honest thing Jake had said in years, the importance of being able to undo your bindings, to free yourself from the ties you'd created. He'd never learned that lesson himself, had tied himself into knots of deception and fraud that had bound him for his entire adult life. But maybe Tommy would do better. On the evening of January 17th, 1950, Jacob Farragut, known to his friends as William Harper, died alone in a charity hospital bed. He was 58 years old, worn down by a hard life and harder choices, and he left behind nothing except those 2 letters and the small mark he'd made on a few lives in Los Angeles. Father Michael held a small funeral service 4 days later. 15 people attended, which was more than Jake had expected. Mrs. Chen was there, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah Henderson was there with her family. A few other church regulars came to pay respects to the quiet old man who'd been part of their community. Father Michael delivered a brief eulogy about kindness and second chances, about how we're all more than our worst moments. Then he paused and said, "William Harper asked me to share something with you all." In his own words, from a letter he wrote before he died. And he read Jake's confession letter aloud, every damning word of it. The silence that followed was absolute. People looked at each other in shock, in confusion, in betrayal. They'd trusted William Harper. They'd welcomed him into their community. And now they learned he'd been a fiction, a mask worn by a criminal, a lie that had lasted 7 years. Sarah Henderson stood up, her face pale. "My grandparents," she said, her voice shaking. "He was the man who, and he let me ... She couldn't finish the sentence. She just gathered her children and walked out of the church, followed by her husband. Mrs. Chen remained seated, though tears were streaming down her face. Why didn't he tell us? She asked nobody in particular. Why hide it? Father Michael looked at the letter in his hands. I think, in his way, Jacob was trying to earn what Jake Farrow had stolen. Not forgiveness. He didn't believe in that. But maybe just the chance to be better. To prove that even someone who'd done terrible things could still do small bits of good. Is that enough? Someone asked from the back of the room. No, Father Michael said honestly. It's not enough. It doesn't undo the harm. It doesn't repay the debts, but it's more than nothing. And sometimes, for people like Jacob, more than nothing is all they have to offer. They buried him in an unmarked grave in a pauper cemetery, a field of anonymous dead who lived anonymous. Lives and left anonymous marks on the world. No headstone. No memorial. Just a numbered plot in the county records that noted Jacob Farragut, alias William Harper, died January 17, 1950, age 5'8". In the weeks that followed, opinions divided. Some people in the church community felt betrayed, angry that they'd been deceived. Others argued that William Harper's actions, regardless of the name he used, had been genuinely kind. The argument went around and around, never fully resolved. Because there was no clear answer. Sarah Henderson took her children back to Iowa that summer. She needed to be around family, needed to be in a place where people knew who they claimed to be. Before she left, she visited her grandparents in Marshall County, both now in their 70s, and told them about William Harper, who was really Jake Farrow. Thomas Henderson listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Did he treat you well?" Thomas finally asked. "This William Harper person, I mean. Did he help you? Was he kind to your children?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "He was. That's what makes it so confusing." Thomas nodded slowly. "I spent 20 years being angry at Jake Farrow. It ate at me, changed me, made me suspicious of everyone. And you know what? He won. By making me bitter, he stole more than our land. He stole my peace. But I'm not saying I forgive him," Thomas interrupted. "I don't. I can't. What he did was monstrous. But if he spent his last years being kind to my granddaughter and my great-grandchildren, then maybe in the end he failed at being Jake Farrow, and that failure, that's the closest thing to justice I'm going to get. Sarah didn't fully understand what her grandfather meant until years later, when her own children were grown and she'd lived enough life to understand the complicated mathematics of harm and healing. The story of Jake Farrow faded from memory. Slowly, the way all stories do. Eleanor Briggs's book was read less and less frequently. The farmers who'd been directly victimized passed away. Their children, who'd lived through the aftermath, grew old. Their grandchildren knew it only as a vague family story about hard times and betrayal, but the impact lingered in ways that were harder to measure. Marshall County remained a place where people locked their doors, where handshake deals were rarer, where newcomers were viewed with a bit more suspicion than hospitality. The culture had been changed by one man's betrayal, shifted just slightly away from openness and toward caution. And in Los Angeles, in a small church community, people occasionally told the story of William Harper, the helpful old man who turned out to be someone else entirely. They told it as a cautionary tale about trust and deception, but also some of them as a strange story about second chances and the possibility of change. Was Jake Farrow evil? Jake Farrow evil? Yes. Was William Harper good? Maybe. Were they the same person? Legally, yes. Morally? That question didn't have an easy answer. In the end, Jake Farrow's quiet crimes taught an uncomfortable truth. That people are more complex than our categories allow. That redemption is messier than our stories suggest. And that trust once broken leaves scars that last for generations. The bandit of the Farmlands died alone in a charity hospital, unmourned by most, remembered by few. His legacy wasn't the money he'd stolen or the schemes he'd pulled. His legacy was the question he left behind. Can someone who destroys trust ever build it again? And if they do, does it matter that the foundation was always a lie? There are no easy answers to those questions. There never were. There never will be. But somewhere in Iowa, farmers still tell stories about Jake Farrow on cold winter nights, when the wind howls across the plains. And somewhere in Los Angeles, an old filing cabinet in a church basement still holds cards drawn by children for a man named William Harper, who taught them how to tie knots and, in his way, showed them how complicated the world really is. That's the price of trust. That's the cost of betrayal. That's the mathematics of a life lived in the shadows, trying too late to find the light. And that's the story of Jake Farrow, the ghost who haunted farmlands and tried, in the end, to haunt them a little more gently. The story you've just heard isn't just about one man's crimes in 1920s Iowa. It's about something deeper, something that still echoes today in every community, every transaction. Every time we choose to trust a stranger or lock our doors against them. Jake Farrow understood something fundamental about human nature. We want to believe in the goodness of others. We want to think that the friendly neighbor is actually friendly, that the helpful hand isn't hiding a knife. That optimism, that hope, is what makes communities possible. It's also what makes us vulnerable. The real tragedy of Jake's story isn't the money he stole. Money can be replaced. It's the trust he destroyed, the innocence he corrupted, the way he transformed open communities into closed ones. That damage ripples forward through generations, changing how we interact with the world, how we raise our children, how we balance hope against caution. But there's another side to this story too. The fact that even someone as calculating and cruel as Jake Farrow spent his final years trying, however imperfectly, to be better. Not for redemption, because he knew there was no redemption for what he'd done, but simply because being better was preferable to being worse. That tells us something about human capacity for change, even when that change comes too late to matter to the people who were hurt. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this: trust carefully, but don't stop trusting. Verify, but don't become so suspicious that you destroy the very communities you're trying to protect. And if you've done wrong, even terrible wrong, the only path forward is to stop doing wrong and start doing right, even if that right can never balance the scales. If you found this story compelling, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. This channel tells the real stories of America's criminals, cons, and outlaws, not just the violence and the headlines, but the complicated human truths beneath them. Stories like Jake Farrow's need to be told, need to be remembered, need to be understood. Drop a comment below telling me, did Jake Farrow deserve a second chance as William Harper? Can someone who destroys trust ever really rebuild it? I want to hear your thoughts, your stories, your experiences with trust and betrayal. And if you want more stories like this one, more tales from the shadows where morality gets complicated and history gets real, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The ghosts of our past still walk among us, teaching us lessons if we're willing to listen. Jake Farrow was one of those ghosts. His crimes were quiet, but their echoes were loud. Remember his name. Remember his victims. Remember that trust is both our greatest strength and our deepest vulnerability. And remember that in the end, we're all just trying to decide who we want to be before our time runs out. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart cautious, and your judgment fair. The shadows have more stories to tell, and I'll be here to tell them. Subscribe, comment, share. The story continues.